Photo exposure is commonly explained using a triangle consisting of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. But neutral density filters are just as important, yet often overlooked. A neutral density filter is a piece of glass placed in front of the lens or in between the lens and the sensor that reduces the intensity of light. With still photography, reducing exposure is as simple as using a faster shutter speed because motion blur is often unwanted unless trying to achieve a specific slow shutter look. But things become a bit more complicated with videography because not enough motion blur between frames can make a video look stuttery or choppy. Cinema predominantly uses a shutter angle of 180 degrees, which is equivalent to 1/48th of a second shutter speed in 24 frames per second. This gives a pleasant balance of motion blur and clarity. Let's use this scene as an example of why neutral density filters are handy. We want optimal dynamic range and minimal noise, so we use the Canon C70's native ISO of 800. We want a blurred background, so we set the aperture wide open to f1.8. And we want a constant amount of motion blur, so we set the shutter angle to 180 degrees. There are now two ways left that light can be adjusted. We first can change the amount of light in the scene itself, but this is not always an option unless you're in a controlled environment. Neutral density filters then finally come into play. On the C70, a selection of 2, 4, or 6 stops of light reduction can be achieved with its built-in rotary ND filters that sit between the lens and the sensor. Lastly, keep in mind neutral density filters can only subtract light and not add it. So if there's a scene that's too dim and you've decided on a specific ISO, shutter angle, and aperture, you'll need to bring in more light into the environment itself.